class on Monday. We talked about it and
Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Combs, and we're going to talk today about critical reading, and we're going to continue to talk about main ideas, but we're now going to talk about main ideas in fiction. Before we talked about how to find the main idea in a work of nonfiction, so an informational paragraph or an article or something that is something written about the real world. And it's actually a little bit easier than it is to determine the main idea of fiction. Usually, we call the main idea of a work of fiction the theme, and it's a little bit more difficult. So, if you find that this is a little more difficult to work through, or when you're reading fiction, when you're reading the stories from Water Street, you've already read three stories: Welcome to Water Street, um, My Girl Mona, and Man Crazy. If you find it a little more difficult to determine the theme or determine the main idea, that's because it is more difficult to determine that for fiction. So let's look at some things that may help us be able to do that. So again, some of the texts we will read this semester come from Crystal Wilkinson's Water Street, a book of short stories. A short story is a piece of prose fiction that typically can be read in one sitting and focuses on a self contained incident or series of linked incidents with the intent of evoking a single effect or mood. So let's kind of analyze this definition because it is a lot. It's a lot of words, it's a lot of content. So let's analyze this definition and see if we can determine exactly what a short story is. So, a short story is a piece of prose. I'm going to go ahead and get my pointer, and maybe I don't want to use red. Maybe I'll use green here. So, a short story is a piece of prose. Now, what prose is writing that is in paragraphs rather than stanzas, like a poem, or rather in dialogue, like a drama or a play. So, prose is writing that's in paragraphs. So, novels, short stories, articles, those are all examples of prose. Okay. So, prose is written in paragraphs, poetry is written in stanzas, and drama is written in lines of dialogue. So, a short story is a piece of prose fiction. So, that means it's a made up story, a story that isn't true. And it can typically be read in one sitting. So, that means that you know how if you're reading a book, by Stephen King, or you're reading a book, you know, your favorite book, you probably read maybe a chapter or so a night or a day and then put it away and then come back to it. Well, with a short story, you typically can read that short story in one sitting. So you sit down to read it and you finish reading it before you get up again. And so it focuses on a self contained incident. So, on a self contained incident, as opposed to, again, a longer work of fiction like a novel or a book, a short story focuses on one event, one self contained event. And by self contained, I mean everything you need to know about that event is told to you in the story. So in a novel, you might actually go through several years in a character's life, or a year, or you may look at several different time periods. But in a short story, you generally focus on one incident, one event, okay? So, in a short story, you probably wouldn't talk about or you wouldn't hear about if you're reading a short story. If you're going to write a short story, you wouldn't want to write about the entire basketball team's season or the entire season of the basketball team. You want to talk about maybe the most important game and maybe even um, the last the last little part of the most important game, right? Someone who shot the winning basket. You might want to focus on just that event. So short stories are very, very focused, very limited. Okay. It could be a series of linked incidents, but really, I find that the best short stories focus on one event. Okay. And with the intent of evoking a single effect or mood. So that's where we come to a theme. Most short stories have several themes. Most works of fiction have several themes, but you'll find that there is a dominant one sometimes. And that doesn't mean that what you see as the dominant theme, it will be what someone else sees. That's what makes short stories and all fiction really difficult to pin down because there's so much in it and there's so much that we bring to those as readers that will affect how we see the events of the story. So, determining the main idea of a short story is an important part of understanding the author's message. And like I said before, the main idea of a short story is usually referred to as the theme. So, how do we determine the theme? Well, let's consider the following story. And this is actually one of Aesop's fables. This is a fable, which is a story usually told to young listeners that illustrates a message or a moral. And Aesop was an ancient writer who wrote fables or told fables. And there you have a bust of Aesop. A bust is sort of like a marble statue showing just the shoulders or neck and head of a figure. So consider this story. A hungry wolf was lurking near a flock of sheep, but the vigilant shepherd gave him no opportunity to satisfy his appetite. One day, the wolf came across a discarded sheepskin. He clothed himself in the skin and was able to hide among the sheep. The disguise fooled the shepherd completely, and that night the wolf was herded into the fold with the sheep. However, this happened to be the night that the shepherd chose one of the sheep to feed his hungry family. Reaching into the pen, the shepherd randomly picked out the disguised wolf and cut his throat. So, this is a fable. We can think a bit about it as a short story. It's a very short story, right? But let's see if we can determine the theme. And I have a sort of, even though it's difficult to do, I have a foolproof method that I think will allow us to arrive at a theme. So, the first thing I'm going to ask is I'm going to ask, what is this story about? Now, I know that it's about sheep, shepherds, wolves, you know, sheepskin. I know it's about those things. But let's not be too literal here. Let's focus on some concepts. So let's focus on some one word concepts that this story is about. And what I might do is stop the video here and allow you to list some concepts that you think this story is about. Okay, so hopefully you've listed one or two concepts that you think this story is about. Let me share with you some things that I came up with. So, what do I think this story is about? Well, I think this story is about diligence. I think it's about diligence because the shepherd gave the wolf no opportunity, so he was very diligent. Diligence, I guess another word for that might be hardworking, right? So the shepherd certainly was hardworking. The wolf itself was hardworking, right? And we say that this is in the story. This is we refer to the wolf as he. So the wolf, he is hardworking. He doesn't give up, right? He lurks near the flock of sheep. he is he doesn't have any opportunity to go and snatch one of the sheep, but he works at it and works at it until he finds the discarded skin, excuse me, and finds a way in. So I think it's about diligence or hardworking. The shepherd is hardworking, the wolf is hardworking. I think it's about disguise, right? The wolf wears a disguise. I think it's about survival. The wolf wants to survive. The sheep want to survive. We don't hear a lot about the sheep. They're sort of like a pawn in this story. The sheep are just there to give the wolf and the shepherd something, I guess, to fight about. The wolf is wanting to survive. The shepherd's wanting to survive. The sheep want to survive. The shepherd's family, they want to survive as well. Irony. If you don't know what irony is, you've probably heard of it before, but just to let you know, is irony is this contrast between what you expect to happen and what actually happens. Often irony is funny. Sometimes we call it tragic when you expect something to happen, but sort of the opposite thing happens, that it's a horrible situation when that happens. We call that sometimes a tragic irony, right? But sometimes irony is very funny. This is sort of tragic and funny, because the wolf thinks that he's getting supper tonight, and in fact the wolf is supper tonight. So that's ironic. Hunger. This is about hunger. It's also about deception. So these can be thought of as subjects of the story. So what is the story about? What are the subjects of the story? Well, diligence, disguise, irony, survival, hunger, deception. If you did not have these words, or you had, some of you may have had a word that means the same thing as diligence or as hunger or as deception. Deception is quite literally pulling the wool over someone's eyes, right? In this case, deception is lying to someone, or making someone believe something that isn't true. If you had other words besides these, that's okay too, because this video can only be so long, so I only listed a few. There are several things this story will be about, and you can probably, if you think about any story that you read, any short story, any novel, some poems actually have stories to them as well. If you can sit and think about them long enough, you'll probably be able to come up with an almost endless list of subjects. So these are subjects of the story. So after you list some subjects, what I want you to do when you're looking at the theme is I want you to pick one of the subjects. It says, now we will choose one of the subjects to focus on. How about deception? So I'm going to choose deception. Okay. Now what you want to do is you want to answer a second question. You want to say, what does the story say about blank, whatever your subject is? So what does the story say about deception? There can be several different answers to this question. So think a little bit about our story with the wolf, and what does the story say about deception? What do you think it says about deception? Okay, here's what I thought it said about deception. So one possible answer, there are several, and even more so with theme than with main idea of nonfiction pieces. As long as you can back up your theme, there are really no wrong answers. As long as you can use evidence from the story or lines from the story that back up what you say, there's not a wrong answer here. So I think that one possible answer is, what does this story say about deception? Well, it says that deception leads to vulnerability. Vulnerability means that you are unprotected, right? If you are vulnerable, you have opened yourself up to harm. So deception leads to vulnerability. And the reason why I say that is because if the wolf was not attempting to deceive the shepherd with his disguise, he wouldn't have been one of the possible choices for supper. So because he was deceiving, because he was using deception, he became vulnerable. So I think that one of the possible things that this story is saying about deception is it leads to vulnerability. Now, you may have come up with something else, and that's just fine. This is what I thought about. If you thought about something else, that's great. This statement is a theme of the story. And stories, like I said, have many different themes. And I don't want you just to believe this. What I did was over here in this speech bubble, I supported this theme by saying, well, here's the way I see it. Deception leads to vulnerability. If the wolf was not attempting to deceive, he would not have been vulnerable. So this is a theme of the story, and the story has other themes. The story has a theme that relates to any one of those subjects that we identified. Okay, this is just the theme that spoke to me. All right. So Daniel and Saphir say the theme of a work of fiction is its controlling idea. We've heard controlling idea before, right? That is the main idea if we're looking at nonfiction. The central insight the story gives us about human life. They go on to say that a theme is not necessarily an idea that a writer consciously decides to focus on before beginning a story. So the writers do not, as a rule, sit down and say, I want to illustrate the point that deception leads to vulnerability. How can I do that in my story? Writers usually just try to write truthfully about life, and their particular way of looking at people and events give their stories a central focus. So sometimes you'll listen to a writer speaking about their craft, and they will say, "Well, I didn't mean for it to mean this. I'm glad it means that for you. That's not what I was thinking, but I was just writing about this situation, and this is what came out of it." That's also why theme is a little more difficult to grasp or to get a hold of than just the main idea of a nonfiction piece. Because a lot of times people do sit down to write nonfiction by saying, "Oh, I want to express the idea that volcanic ash, if you remember something from our last video, that volcanic ash it can destroy but also give life. So here I'm going to write this nonfiction piece." Now, writers do that, but usually when they're writing fiction, they don't sit down to illustrate a point. They sit down to write truthfully about life, and the point sort of grows out of that writing. So, as you investigate the stories in Water Street to determine possible themes, you can begin by asking the two questions we asked earlier about Aesop's fable to first determine a subject and then determine what Wilkinson, not the Wilkinson, so I'm gonna end my show here. I want to discard. I don't know why I have that the in there. Okay, so what Wilkinson, sorry about that, is saying about that subject. So, when you're trying to determine the theme, you want to ask first, what is this story about, to determine a possible subject, then ask, what does this story say about that subject, to determine one of the story's themes. It all seems so simple, and actually, it really doesn't seem that simple to me. But however, that first question, what is this story about, can be a difficult question to answer. You shouldn't expect the subject and/or theme of a work to jump out at you every time. Some works, in fact, most of them are complex and take a couple readings and a lot of thinking to sort out the theme. Here are some other questions that can help you, the reader, determine what a work of fiction is ultimately about. So, what words, images, or scenes are repeated throughout the story? Sometimes these can lead to generalizations, which can in turn lead to possible themes. So, think about words, images, or scenes that are repeated. Who is the main character? What happens to this character? Does he or she undergo a change? Should the reader identify with this character? Sometimes you will identify with a character and sometimes you will not. Sometimes the character in the story does every single thing that you do not think he or she should do. And you're, screaming at the story sometimes. Why are you doing this? I've done that with books that I've read or stories I've read. I do it a lot with TV um, and movies. Does the author explicitly state any generalizations about the human condition? Do any of the characters make such statements? If you have a character that sort of pronounces this words of wisdom, pronounces words of wisdom about life, or gives advice to another character, the theme may be found by noticing what that character is saying. What are the main conflicts? Conflicts are the areas of tension in the story. Um, there's definitely, if you remember Yolanda's story, My Girl Mona, there are definitely conflicts between Yolanda and Mona, right? Um, that Mona, they've been friends for so long, and then Mona doesn't even realize when Yolanda is having a panic attack or about to have a panic attack, and she doesn't ask her anything about the panic attacks. And Yolanda wants Mona to say, well, is there anything they can do, or, and express some concern. She doesn't. So there's definitely a conflict. There are some conflicts internally within Yolanda themselves. There are conflicts within Mona in Man Crazy. There's a conflict of how she has not found what she's looking for, and that's the reason why she has so many men in her life, because she's not quite found what she's looking for. um, who wins the conflicts and why? Maybe that it will indicate what the theme is. What focus does the title of the story provide? Are there any passages in the story where the title is invoked? So that just means, are there any passages in the story where the title is represented in the story somehow? These passages are important, excuse me, and can lead to a possible theme. And here are some of the things to keep in mind as you construct statements of theme. So here are some questions that you might use. What I might do is you might just have these questions, print this slide out, and have these questions with you as you read stories so you can be reminded of these. But here are some other things that you can use to help you craft the statement of theme, okay? So a statement of theme is never just one word. It is a subject plus a comment. It's never just the subject. So Harman and Holman are actually two authors who have written a book, and they compiled a book of definitions for a bunch of terms that refer to literature. Um, and they update this every so many years. Um, so they're the go-to people when you want to learn about literary terms or definitions of terms that relate to literature. So Harman and Holman point out theme implies a subject and a predicate of some time. So the predicate is the last part of a sentence. So not just vice in general, but some such proposition as vice seems more interesting than virtue, but turns out to be destructive, right? So sin basically seems a lot more fun than being virtuous, but it can destroy you in the end, right? So it's not just vice, but it's this comment on vice. So remember, theme is never just one word. It's not just a subject. It's a subject plus a comment on that subject. Also, theme is not immoral. Statements of theme should not begin, people should, or you should not. Themes do not teach, they reveal truths. So a statement of theme would not be, one should not try to escape death, but attempting to escape death can lead one to it more quickly. So the first one is telling you what you should or should not do, but the second one is just revealing something about death. If you try to escape death, the very things you do to try to prolong your life may actually bring you to death more quickly. The first statement there, one should not try to escape death, is a moral. It tries to teach a lesson. But the second statement simply reveals it is a theme. There is no correct way to state the theme of a work of fiction. Furthermore, literary works can encompass several themes. In fact, no statement of theme that can be backed up with evidence from the work is wrong. And also, you don't have to agree with the sentiment of a theme. So you don't have to believe what the theme is saying to be able to see it in a work. So it's perfectly acceptable for me to say, I think the author of this work, whatever, is saying that war is justified in some cases, but I just don't agree. I don't agree that war is ever justified. Or maybe the author is saying war is never justified. War, and you might think, oh, well, no, I don't agree with that. I think that sometimes it is justified. There are some times when we need to go to war. So you can recognize themes that you don't agree with. And that's a little more difficult. It's a little more difficult to not recognize those, but actually to state those, because we usually don't like to make statements we don't agree with, right? But no, it can be done. And also, a statement of theme should be universal and go beyond the story itself. So, for example, the theme of The Lion King is not Simba had to go back and help his family. Well, that's relating just to The Lion King. That's not relating to the world in general. And statements that are themes, should always relate more generally to the world. So instead of saying Simba had to go back and help his family, I might say something like duty is sometimes greater than personal interest. So, yes, Simba would love to just lounge around all day with Timon and Pumbaa, but he has a duty and he has to go back and help his family because of that duty. So that's saying the same thing, really. Duty is sometimes greater than personal interests, but that last line applies to several situations, not just the Lion King. The second, like I said, the second statement certainly applies to the Lion King, but it applies more generally to life as well. And here are just a list of the references. So what I want to do is look at the short story Man Crazy. So I'm going to pull up a document here, and I'm going to pull up the story Man Crazy. Now, this is the story about Mona, and I'm going to go through this process for determining a theme of this story with you, okay? And then what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to, the stories that we're reading currently, which I think are about Jeanette, the Reverend Townsend, and Sandy Crawford, I'm going to ask you to choose one of those and determine the theme by going through, or not the theme, but a theme, because there could be several, but determine a theme by going through this process for that story, okay? So I'm going to do this for Man Crazy. This is the story about Mona. And if you remember, Mona is at the doctor's office, and she's actually getting she's going to a checkup, but she's at the gynecologist, I think, right? So she's getting a checkup for her lady parts, I guess. And she's in the waiting room in this story. And she's sort of thinking about her life and thinking about all the men that she has had in her life. And you've read this, so I don't have to go through the entire story. But when I sit down and think, what is this story about? When I sit down and I think about a list of subjects for this story, and I did this a while ago, so I'm going to reach down here and get my journal. Yeah, in your journal, this is the best place for you to do these writings. Just write in your journal. That's why I wanted you to have a journal, because I wanted you to be able to just open it up and write. So, when I think about this story, what do I think this story is about? Well, one of the things I think this story is about is about family. Mona has been married uh, 3 times, I think. She's considering being married again. She's a mother uh, to her children. Remember, her oldest children is in, or start maybe, yeah, the oldest is starting college, or maybe it's the youngest starting college. Let's see. Um, uh, the oldest is in college, yeah. So family is something this story is about. This story is certainly about sex, right? I mean, Mona thinks about sex, thinks about the many men that she has been with. Um, it's about attraction. It's about appearance. Mona is very concerned about her appearance. She looks around the room and she is glad to notice that she's still the best looking one there, even though she's what, in her 40s, I think. I mean, I think that someone in their 40s could certainly be good looking. I think someone in their 80s could be good looking, but Mona has a certain view of womanhood. I think this is about womanhood, what it means to be a woman. Beauty, maybe, love, growing up. It's about virginity, maybe. Um, maybe losing your virginity, maybe. It's about relationships. Relationships. So Mona talks about and thinks about her relationships with her children. She thinks about her relationship with her doctor. Even her doctor's been her doctor for a long time. She thinks about her relationships with her husbands, her current boyfriend, other men. Um, Maybe it's about roles, and what I mean by roles is maybe women's roles in society. Mona says, "Well, I've never been quite the mother type. She did what she was supposed to do. She kissed and hugged them, made sure they had new shoes and coats in August, Christmas presents in December. But she is man crazy." So see, here's where the title is in the story. But she is man crazy. Her children have always been a close second to her weekend getaways in the mountains, her midnight trysts, and her honeymoons at the beach. Somehow she couldn't help herself. So maybe there's a theme there. Um, I don't know. So, okay, I've listed several things. And what I might choose, um, I will choose sex. Okay. Mona thinks a lot about sex. Um, and I know that that's important to actually both of the stories that we read today, or that we read, um, My Girl Mona and Man Crazy, they both talk about this incident where the first time that Mona has sex is with Yolanda's brother Kiki, who was much older than her. He was 20, well, not much older. He was 25, she was 17, right? It was her first time. And then later on, we're going to hear Kiki talk about it as well. So be watching for that. So I'm going to choose sex, and so I'm thinking about Mona, and I'm thinking about what this story is saying about sex, and so when I read this, I want to look at a couple of passages. The first passage that I'm going to read is when she starts to think about all the men that she has had in her life. And she says, well, she says Kiki was her first here, but there's one part where she says, her mind sifted through them all, one by one, but love had always been the core in Mona's mind. The kind of love that kept a couple married for life, just like those old couples she saw in church, still holding hands and kissing each other on the cheek after 60 years of marriage, exchanging glances over something cute the grandchildren did. That is what she wanted. With each of the three husbands, that's what she had hoped for. With the boyfriends, even, with the ones she had just slept with. Love, Mona says to herself aloud, and gains some stares in the waiting room. So when she talks about Kiki, she said Kiki was embarrassed, ashamed, really, his eyes darting from the ceiling to the floor to avoid her, all of her. He was 25. Mona remembered the pain and the knotted up wad of a heart she had left back then. It had shrunk the size of a crabapple, knobby and hard. That's when she began to search for something she couldn't quite name and something she hadn't quite gotten. So Mona continues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight some things here. Let's see. I used to have a highlighter. Yeah, here we go. So I'm going to highlight some things here. I'm going to highlight love had always been the core in Mona's mind, the kind of love that kept a couple married for life. With each of the three husbands, that's what she had hoped for. I'm going to say that that's when she began to search for something she couldn't quite name and something she hadn't quite forgotten. All she thought she ever wanted was a good man, but she loved her babies, although they were just byproducts of her search. So the babies are just byproducts of her search. So basically, she's searching. She's searching for something, and she's not found it. So what I'm going to also do is look here at the very end where she talks about as she's being examined, she talks about she thinks about the sex act, and she thinks about what happens after sex. So an emptiness, this borderline whorish feeling that she has been pounded into submission. This gets a little graphic for me. Actually, I'm kind of glad we're talking about this in the video, so you can't see my red cheeks probably. But she mourns the loving part, the before part, like the death of a relative. Usually there's no cuddling afterward, but sometimes the man rubs her face gently as if to say thank you. So Mona has been searching ever since that first time, and after the act is finished, the way that she felt and the way that Kiki acted toward her, oh, you're just my sister's friend, it didn't mean to him what it meant to her. And since then, she's been searching. And I think what she's come to learn based on these passages is that there's more to it than just sex, right? So, what I might say is a theme here might be that sex is not fulfilling or satisfying without something more. So she thinks she just wants a good man. But really, every time that she's had a man and she's had sex, that's not enough for her. So sex is not fulfilling or satisfying without something more there, without there being something else, without that love, maybe that's going to take you with this person that you're experiencing this very intimate act with, that's not, sex is not going to make your relationship last. There has to be something more. And in fact, I think what she comes to realize, and what she's so disheartened about, is that she's not fulfilled by sex because she only has sex. She has not yet found that something more, that real something more. She's had 3 husbands, but apparently, and we don't hear a lot about those husbands, but apparently she's had 3 husbands, but it's not worked out. She has a current boyfriend, but the way that she talks about him, it's not, she hasn't found what she's looking for. And she ends the story saying, in her mind, she's already moved on, searching for the next man, looking for something, hoping that with him things will be different. So I think that's why Mona is a very sad character to me, because uh, because she realizes that the sex is not the good stuff. It's not fulfilling or satisfying to her because it doesn't accompany the something more there, right? So what I've done here is I've listed several subjects of the story. Then I chose one of those, and I looked for places in the story where I could get a feel for what this story is saying about that subject. So I chose sex, and then as I read through the story, I highlighted the parts that make me think that what Mona comes to realize is that sex is not fulfilling or satisfying without something more there. And it's what she hasn't found yet. And it's why she continues her search. Okay, now you can read this story, and you, because you're a different person than I am, can have experiences and can have, knowledge. You've read and watched and experienced several different things than I have, maybe some of the same things, but different things than me. So you might pick out something else. You might even pick out another word. You might want to pick out love, perhaps, or might want to pick out relationships and say, what does this story say about relationships? But to me, this is what I saw, and this is what I chose. So this is a theme of the story. A theme of the story is sex is not fulfilling or satisfying without something more there. So, this is what I want you to do for one of the 3 stories that we're reading currently. If you go out of this video to the assignment, you'll see an assignment sheet that will ask you to choose one of the stories, list subjects about that story, and then come to a statement of theme. And then after you come to that statement, rather than just highlight, go ahead and type out the passages from the story that make you think that that is what the story is saying about that subject. All right. Okay. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know.